Last Sunday I was at home sitting on the couch and had my feet up and I had a Coke and I was relaxing and I was watching a sporting event on TV and I was scratching the dog's ears. And Kathy came in and she said, "How come you're not doing anything?" I was resting, I was scratching the dog's ears, I was having a drink, and I was watching a sporting event. And she said I wasn't doing anything. Now, that's not a true story. That doesn't happen in our family. But it's amusing to us for a couple of reasons. It's amusing because of the difference between the way a male mind thinks and the way a female mind thinks. But it's also amusing to us because in our society, there's this prevailing idea that rest is unimportant, unproductive. But you know, God tells us to rest. In fact, it's so important to God that He put it on His top 10 list. It's one of the 10 Commandments, is that we are supposed to rest. And as you know, if you've been with us, we've been studying the 10 Commandments together, where we spent a week looking at the fact that God is the one who spoke these, and He actually wrote them in stone with His own finger. They're so important. We took a week to realize that before God started giving these laws, He introduced Himself as the self-existent God, as the God who redeems His people. And then we looked at the first 2 commandments. We looked at the commandment that says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And last week, the second commandment that says, "You shall not make or bow down to any images, any idols." Now, if you know the 10 Commandments, we're skipping one. The one that says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain." We'll get to that next week, and it probably doesn't mean what you think it means. And so you might look forward to that. But because it was a holiday weekend, I thought it might be better to skip ahead one and look at the 4th commandment. And so that's where we are today, and that's what we'll be looking at. The 4th commandment is in Exodus chapter 20, and it's verses 8 through 11. This is the longest of all 10 commandments. It's the longest one. And I want to read it to you. You can follow along in your Bibles or your devices. It'll be on the screen if you'd rather look up there. This is the 4th commandment. "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." We're going to look at this command. And I said that all of these commands except 2 are stated in the negative, but they imply a positive command. This one's stated in the positive, and it implies a negative command. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but we'll mention that. And then we're going to talk about how this commandment reveals some of the character of God. We're going to take a little different direction today than we have with the others, because I spent some time showing you how each of these commandments so far is throughout the entire Bible. I'm not going to do that today. This one is too, but there are so many issues that impact our obedience to this commandment, and I wanted to take some time to address those. And I have more to say, or had more to say, than I could decide what to squeeze into my notes, and so I decided that that section wasn't as important this week as these things. So let's just talk about the command. It begins, remember. Remember the Sabbath day. It doesn't say do not do something. It says remember the Sabbath day. This implies they already knew about the Sabbath day. Now, some people think that Adam knew about the Sabbath day because it's based on creation, where God created in 6 days, and on the 7th day He rested. We don't know if Adam passed that story along because he knew it, or Moses wrote this down because he was inspired by God. We don't know. There isn't mention of the Sabbath before this, but until you get to Exodus 16. And Exodus is a chronological book, so these people did know about the Sabbath by the time the 10 Commandments were given, because if you remember the story, when they left slavery in Egypt and were set free, they wandered in the wilderness for a number of years. And they had no food, and God rained down bread from heaven. They called it manna. And God told them when the manna started coming, gather enough for each day. But after 6 days, he said, now gather enough for 2 days. And on the 7th day, they didn't have manna because they gathered enough for 2 days the day before. And for 40 years, God fed these people with bread from heaven 6 days out of 7. And on the 7th day, they weren't supposed to go gather it. They were just supposed to eat what they had already prepared or already gathered from the day before. So they knew about this idea of Sabbath. And this command is to remember it. Now, remember in Hebrew means a whole lot more than bring it to mind. I've told you this before, and the example that's so good in Scripture is the example of Joseph in Genesis. He was put in prison, and he happened to be in the same prison as Pharaoh's cupbearer and Pharaoh's baker. And he told Pharaoh's cupbearer that he would be restored to his position, pulled out of prison and put back basically on the Pharaoh's cabinet, because that's what a cupbearer, he was so trusted, that's a part of what he did. And when that was going to happen, Joseph said, when you're with Pharaoh, remember me here in prison. He wasn't saying, think about me once in a while. He was saying, remember that I'm an innocent man and do something about it. That's what remember means in Hebrew. It means to do something about it. So when God tells us to remember the Sabbath, he's telling us to do something other than bring it to mind. Somebody said remembering the Sabbath is kind of like remembering your anniversary. You know, if you just think about your anniversary date because you remember what day it is, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good, or your spouse a whole lot of good, does it? If you remember your anniversary, you're saying something to your spouse, you're giving your spouse a card or a gift, or you're going out to dinner together or something like that. That's how you remember an anniversary. And so when we remember the Sabbath, we're doing something about it. The negative of this command is spelled out. He says, don't do work 1 day out of 7. Don't do your regular work 1 day out of 7. That's the negative expression of this command. Instead, remember the Sabbath. You know what Sabbath means? It means to stop, to cease. That's what it means, to stop or to cease. God says, okay, work, do your own thing for 6 days, work what you need to do, but on 1 day of the week, stop doing that. Cease doing that thing. That's what Sabbath means. And everywhere in the Scriptures you see the Sabbath talked about, the emphasis is not on anything but rest. Every passage in the Old Testament that reminds the people of the Sabbath says you're supposed to quit your work and rest. And that's the emphasis of the Sabbath. Whatever else we say about the Sabbath, we have to remember that's the emphatic thing. Rest. That's what God is telling us to do. It's a universal principle. Notice what he says here. He says it's not just for Jews. It's for you. It's for your children. It's for your slaves, or for us, our employees, maybe. He even says it's for your animals. You know, if you have a beast of burden, you should give that a day of rest as well. And then he said it's even for the foreigner who's in your land, that they should be allowed a day of rest. It's a universal principle that applies to everybody. And the reason it does is because it's a cycle that God built into creation. It's a cycle that God built into creation. It goes all the way back to creation, as we just mentioned. In 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth. And on the 7th day, he rested. Did God need rest? You know, was creation that hard? You know what God did? He simply spoke it into being, and it was there. Our God is a God who never slumbers nor sleeps. God did not need rest. God rested because it's an example for us. Because it's the cycle that he built into creation. That things can only go so long, and then they need a break. They need rest. Which tells us that the Sabbath was made for us. Because we need it. That's what Jesus tells us. We'll look at that. He says the Sabbath was made for man. We'll talk about that in just a little bit later. But it's a universal principle because it's a part of creation. It's a part of the cycle of creation because we need it. And so God puts that into his commandments. Remember that one day. Well, what does this tell us about God? Every one of these commandments reveals something about the character of God. What does that reveal about the character of God? Well, I think it reveals that he is sovereign over daily affairs. And the reason I think it does is because we can't stop doing our normal duties one day a week if we really don't believe that God is in charge. If we really don't believe that God controls the events of our lives, then we will not stop because we somehow think inside of us he needs help to accomplish what he wants to accomplish through us. And so the Sabbath should be a reminder. Stopping one day a week should be a reminder that God's in control, and we're not. But I think it also tells us that God is never in a hurry. God is never in a hurry. God has a perfectly timed plan for all of creation. He has a perfectly timed plan for all of his creatures, all of his people, and that would include us. He always works out his plan in his time, and he doesn't have to hurry to do it. We don't see Jesus hurrying when he was walking on earth. And yet we live in such a society that we're often hurried. And remembering the Sabbath, stopping, reminds us that God is not in a hurry, that he will accomplish his work in his time, in his sovereign way. Well, it's an easy command. At least the outward surface command is pretty easy. But for us, there are a lot of issues that impact our obedience. And that's what I want to spend my time thinking about today, is some of the issues that impact our obedience of this simple command. And I put 5 of them in your notes. There's probably more, but these are the 5 that just seemed significant. I think this is the longest command for a reason. I think it's the longest command because it's one that we struggle to obey. As I said, all of these commands have an outward obedience, a surface obedience, but they also have a heart obedience. And I think this one's hard for us on both levels. And maybe that's why it's the longest one, because we struggle with it. 5 different factors. Number 1, the Christian life should never be wearisome. The Christian life can be a battle. It can be filled with trials and difficulties. It can have persecution. The Christian life will have grief and sorrow. But it should never be wearisome. There'll be times in our Christian life when we're tired, but we shouldn't be burnt out or spent. We shouldn't be burdensomed that way. Now, why do I say that? Well, both the Old Testament and the New Testament tell us that. A couple of famous verses. What does it say in Isaiah 40:31? They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. What about the words of Jesus? Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You see, if we're living the Christian life the way we should live it, we should not be burdened. We should not be weary. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament tell us that. But we struggle with that, don't we? And we struggle with that because we live in a very frantic, driven society. That's my second consideration. We live in a driven society. We have fast lane lives, don't we? We are always hurried, always stressed. Somebody said Americans are adrenaline junkies. We're hooked on adrenaline. We run our lives in such a way that our adrenaline levels are always high. And if we stop for a minute and they begin to drop, we don't feel normal all of a sudden. And so we want to keep going. We are adrenaline junkies. We live in that kind of society. Here's some of the evidence that we live in a driven society. A type A personality is considered a virtue. It's not. Now, it's not wrong. Don't misunderstand me. A type A personality is not wrong, but it's not a virtue. And our society puts a virtue on people that are more driven than people that are not. Every personality type has its strength, but it also has its weaknesses. And so having that kind of personality is not a virtue. It's just different. And it's okay. But our society says if you're driven, you're a better person. We've been taught also that busyness equals productivity, haven't we? If you aren't being busy, you aren't productive. That's why the story I told in the beginning that I told you wasn't true kind of makes us laugh, because somehow we have a belief in that if we're not busy, we're not producing. An arrow can fly straight and fast and miss the target. And our lives can be straight and fast and furious and still miss the point. And so that busyness does not necessarily equal productivity. Our downtime is sometimes more stressful and more structured than our work time. Have you experienced that? Did you ever come home from a vacation exhausted? Or come off of a weekend and go back to work and look forward to going back to work because you can catch your breath while you're there? If so, you know what I mean. I mean, sometimes our downtimes are more structured than our work. They're more stressful than our work. And that's an indication that we live in a driven society. And one other indication that we live in a driven society is work is often taken home or even taken on vacation. And I know some of you have jobs that sometimes require that. But it's especially true in today's world with our digital leashes, is what I call them. You can't get away because of cell phones and pagers and all of these other digital things we have. Sometimes we can't get away, and we end up taking work home. We end up taking work on vacation. We have this notion that if we turn something off for even a day, we're going to fall so far behind we'll never catch up. Sometimes that's the notion that we have in our heads. And yet, in the midst of that, God says, rest. And I want you to think about that for a minute in terms of one of our considerations. God's design is that we take Sabbath rest. It's so important, again, he put it on his top 10 list of what to do. In fact, it's right near the top, isn't it? Remember the Sabbath rest. Keep it holy. Set it apart. What for? For rest. To stop doing what you do the rest of the week. Have you ever considered that rest is holy? Has that ever occurred to you? That's what it says. The rest is holy. Some days the most righteous thing you can do is take a nap. Yeah. If you're lazy like me, you say amen. Well, sometimes the most righteous thing you can do is slow down and take a nap. But if it's true that rest is holy, that also means that not resting the way we should is sin. That sounds harsh, doesn't it? You know what? Look at the last 7 of these commandments. And the last 6, if we do what they say don't do, if we do the opposite, we all would consider it sin. Almost the whole world would. But we treat this one different. We look at this one and we don't consider it sin if we don't obey it. But it is. It is. And it's important as all the others. We should treat it just the same. Now, it's also, on the other hand, easy to get legalistic about this one. The Jews got legalistic about it. They had a long list of what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. You could walk this far, but if you walked any further, that was work, so you were breaking the Sabbath laws. You could do these things, but you couldn't do these things. And they got so legalistic about it, they forgot the whole principle altogether. It's easy to do that. It's also easy to get legalistic about the day. There are those who believe that Saturday is the true Sabbath on our calendar. I'll tell you why I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that because the Sabbath was started when the manna came. And the first Sabbath was the seventh day after the manna came. There's no indication that the manna started coming on a calendar equivalent to the first day of creation. Nothing says that. Nothing indicates that. And so we don't even know if they were celebrating the same cycle of 7 days that creation would have been on. Also, there are at least two different times when Israel lost the Sabbath for years. When Manasseh was king, he was king for 55 years and the Sabbath wasn't celebrated. It was later that it was reinstituted. When Nehemiah came back from exile and built the wall around Jerusalem, he had to reestablish the Sabbath because people weren't obeying it. There's no indication that they knew that cycle of 7 days was on the same cycle. And so what I believe is that the principle is far more important than the day, and it's far more important than the regulations. The principle is the important thing, and the principle is that we stop doing what we do the rest of the week and rest. What is rest for you? You know, if you sit in an office all day, maybe rest isn't sitting on your couch at home. Maybe it's getting up and going for a walk. Maybe it's going for a game of golf or tennis. There's a lot of people that play those games. Maybe that's restful. Maybe that's a better break for your soul than something else. I don't know what rest is for you, but that's what the command is, to rest. I believe that Jesus supported this idea of the principle rather than the specific day when he addressed the Jews who were trying to be legalistic about the Sabbath. And he said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You see, God didn't set aside the seventh day and say, that's for me. He set aside the seventh day for us because we need that seventh day. It was made for us, not for him. And so I believe the point is that we need those Sabbath rests. I think that's what we need to remember. You know, in spite of that, it sometimes goes against our grain, doesn't it? We have this American work ethic, and I have to say that word carefully. If you've been around here, you know why. I always turn it around. That says we should never stop. And yet God says we should stop. You know, there's a lot of scientific evidence that there's benefits, health benefits and other benefits for taking a Sabbath. I'm not going to talk about studies or anything else. I'm just going to list them real quickly here. You can look these up if you're really interested. There's psychological tests, there's scientific-based tests that show some of these things. Taking a day off puts less stress in your life the other days. That's something we could all enjoy. Taking a day off gives you better health overall. Maybe because of the first one. And taking a day off will lengthen your life. Isn't that interesting? Probably because of the first two. But that's some studies that have been shown. Taking a day off will give you better use of time. Now that goes against our grain, doesn't it? It goes against our thinking. If we have 7 days, let's use them all and make use of that time. But studies show it's just the opposite. People are more efficient if they take a day off. They're more efficient the other 6 days. And finally, one of the benefits of taking a Sabbath is long-term effectiveness. Not just because it's more efficient in the short term, but also because in the long term it means better life, better health, longer life, and it means less burnout. And again, you could look these up. I've found them on the internet in the past. All of those are benefits of taking a Sabbath. And so it's something we need to do. Now there's one other issue I want to address, and that's because it's kind of been the Christian tradition for years and years and years. And the question is this: is the Sabbath for worship? Is the Sabbath day for worship? That's kind of been the traditional Christian view. We take our Sabbath on Sunday, we go to worship. You know, that's never said in the scriptures. It's never said. However, I want you to consider a couple things about that. In this passage, God calls the Sabbath a Sabbath to the Lord. What does it mean to cease everything else and give that day to the Lord? There are places where God calls it His Sabbath, even though it was made for us. You know, in Leviticus 23, it calls the Sabbath a holy convocation. What's a convocation? It's a gathering of people. In Numbers chapter 28, it says the sacrifices for each day. On the seventh day, on the Sabbath day, there's extra sacrifices, which might imply people were gathering together in the temple or the tabernacle for that. Jesus set an example by, as far as we can tell, almost every Sabbath being in the synagogue. In the early church, in their practice, decided to change the Sabbath from what's the sixth day on our calendar to the first day, from Saturday to Sunday, because that's when Jesus was resurrected. And so is the Sabbath for worship? Biblically, it never says that. It's never specified. But there is a long-term tradition that says that's a really good thing to do on the Sabbath. If you're going to quit your work for a day and give that day to God, that's a good time to spend some time in worship as well. And so I don't argue that point. I think it's a good point. But I want you to realize the real emphasis all the way through the Scriptures is stop working and rest. That's what the commandment tells us to do. How do we obey that? It's a pretty simple command. And I'm not going to separate our outward obedience from our inward obedience today, because I think they overlap a lot on this particular commandment. And so here's some things that we can do. Number one, determine that God really does know best. This is where inward obedience begins. God does know best. You are not an exception to the cycle God built into creation. You're not. You're not an exception to us. You cannot improve on God's standards. You need rest, just like everybody else does. I know there are people who can get by on 3 hours of sleep a night. I know there are people that can seem to go 24/7, but eventually it's going to wear them down because they're going against what God put into creation. So just take some time to say, God, you know what's best. You know better than I do. And then if you're weary, confess that weariness to God. God, I'm weary. And maybe this is why. Maybe it's because I'm doing too much. Maybe it's because I'm not taking time off. Maybe it's because I'm trying to serve you in an area where I'm not gifted to serve you. And believe me, that'll always lead to burnout. But whatever it is, just take time to confess to God your weariness. And then schedule times of rest. Put them on your schedule. Take the days off that you're given at work and make them days off. And holidays, whatever holidays you're given, take those holidays and make them days of rest. Take whatever vacations you're giving. I know some jobs try to make that impossible. But take whatever they give you and plan rest on those days. You know, it's okay to block off a day or a time on your calendar and put nothing in there and put rest in there or something like that. And it's okay to tell people, I have plans for that time. Because nothing is something that you need to plan. It's okay to tell people that. You know, can we meet this day? No, I have plans that day. They don't need to know it's a plan for nothing. But it is a plan. So put it into your plan. And then when you have downtime, practice true downtime. Practice true downtime. Again, sometimes we come home from vacations more exhausted than when we left. Maybe you should go to the cabin instead of Disney World. Now, I'm not against Disney World. Don't take me wrong on that. But my point is, we plan sometimes our vacations so full that we never get rest. If you're going to go to Disney World, plan some margin in there. Put a day or two on each end to catch up, to get ready, and to catch up. We, as you know, we love to camp, and that's what we do for our vacations in the summertime. And when we have a week off, sometimes we'll go for a weekend and just spend 2 nights camping. But when we have a whole week, we don't camp the whole week. We camp about 4 days. 4 nights, 4 days. And then we take a day or two to get ready, and we take a day or two to clean up and catch up when we get back. And those camping days are the most restful days we have in our lives. That's why we enjoy it so much, because we're out there where we can spend more time with God and each other and just slow our pace. But sometimes we have to plan those margin days on the sides. So if you're taking your family to Disney World, go and have fun and enjoy it. But plan some margin in there so you get some rest as well, because those kind of vacations are not always restful. If it's downtime, make it real downtime. And when we talk about planning, somebody said it this way. They said, depart daily, withdraw weekly, and abandon annually. Take at least some time every day to kind of depart from the busyness and focus on God. Take some time every week to withdraw from the world and rest. And take at least some time every year just to abandon the rest of the world and walk away from it. And I think those are good instructions. And I think the way God spelled out holidays in the Old Testament testifies to that. They had a weekly day off. They had some annual days off. And all the way through, God tells us to spend some time with Him. And so that daily is a good thing to do. Next practical step, narrow your focus. Narrow your focus down to just a few things that are really important. To those few things that you really believe God called you to do. Narrow your focus down to those. What is it that God wired you for? What are you gifted to do? And narrow your focus down to that. And then learn to say no to other things that aren't a part of that. Sometimes we have trouble saying no as Americans. It's okay to say no to things that don't fit the way God wired you, the things God called you to. It's okay to say no to those. And by the way, it's also okay to say no to time-saving devices that really aren't. How many times do you get a new time-saving device and you think it's going to save you time, so actually add more to your calendar and you end up being busier? That's pretty much the American story. This was 10 years ago, but I read an article that says the most hated device in America is the cell phone. Well, it's a great time-saving device, but people feel tied down to it, and it doesn't save time. It adds things to their schedule instead. It's okay to say no to some of those things, or at least put them aside occasionally. So narrow your focus, learn to say no. And then ultimately, find your rest in God. Find your rest in God. Because that's where true rest comes from. We've looked at Psalm 23 a couple times. He's the one who restores our souls. We don't do that, He does. We looked at Jesus' words a couple times. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. It comes from being with Jesus, coming to Jesus. And again, Isaiah 40, they that wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll run and not be weary. We find our strength, we find our restoration in God, coming to Jesus Christ, the Son of God, waiting on God, not rushing ahead of Him. One of the commentators told a story that I just found a really powerful story. And he said, if you were walking down the street and a beggar came to you wanting a handout, and you reached in your pocket and had 7 $1 bills, and you gave him 6 and put 1 back in your pocket, what would you think of that beggar if he said, that's unfair, and he beat you up and took the 7th dollar? You'd think that wasn't a very gracious beggar, was it? A robbery, not a begging. The commentator said that's exactly what we do. God says, I have 7 days. 1's for me and 6 are for you. And we get mad and we steal the 7th. Wow. That was powerful. We need to take that 7th day as a rest, because that's what God designated it for. I don't care what day it is. If you're like me and my staff, we work on Sundays. It's not a good rest day for some of us. Brittany's laughing at me, she knows, so it's Carrie Ann. It's a work day, so find that time of rest, whatever day it is, and give your soul and your body a break. And in that, find your rest in God. Make room for God, because that's where you'll find your rest. Making room for God does not mean add something else to your schedule that includes God. It means have God become your source for everything else. That's what it means.